Hey, I am J.E. Prazzi, speculative fiction author, the writer of the Malfunction Trilogy and the Raventree Society, and the acquisitions editor for the Phoenix Fiction Writers. And we are here today because by popular vote on Twitter, I have decided to give you guys some writing tips on horror. Now, there's a reason why I chose this topic today. The reason why I chose it as one of the options for the poll, and that is because today, episode 2 of the second season of the Raventree Society has gone live on Amazon. And I know this is all backwards to you guys, but you can still appreciate this gorgeous cover. This is the complete collection of season 1. That's 5 episodes. And we're doing the same deal this year, 5 episodes every other month, and then a collection in October. So the second episode is out. I'm really excited about it. I was really scared to publish this one. It's got a lot of really strong, dark themes in it, a little bit darker than some of the other ones, which you might say, hey, horror is dark. How do you get darker? There is darker themes in this, but hopefully I did it well and respectfully, and hopefully you guys are excited about the things that have been revealed. So if you haven't yet, head over to my YouTube channel, of course, when this is done, and check out the trailer for it. It's just really short, but hopefully that'll give you guys kind of a hint as to what the big reveal is. If you haven't read anything yet, each of the episodes are 99 cents on Amazon, or you can get the collection of all of them. And you can also read these on Kindle Unlimited. If you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read those for free on there. So they're easy to get your hands on. And also there's a 3,000 word short story, which probably won't make a ton of sense to you if you're not a regular reader of this series, but that's available for free on my website in the extras. So yeah, we're going to jump into it, talking about writing horror. So when I first started writing the Raventree Society, I was actually really scared to call it horror because horror has a very specific meaning to it to a lot of people. And I was worried that people would read it and be like, this isn't scaring me, this isn't horror. So I labeled it as a paranormal thriller. I still think there's, in some ways, it still kind of fits under those categories. But since seeing the reviews start to come in, seeing how much it freaked out so many people, they're like, yeah, this is horror. This is definitely horror. You shouldn't call it anything else. So thus it is now labeled as horror, and I don't try to pretend it's anything else. Yay, boost for my confidence. So that kind of brings me into my first point on writing horror. And that is that horror and fear are subjective feelings. I've had some reviews on Raventree of people who are like, ghosts don't really scare me. I liked the story, and I was, compelled by the characters, and I enjoyed the plot and the mystery, but it wasn't scary to me because I'm not scared of ghosts. And I have had other people who are not able to sleep after reading it because it scared them so much. So it really depends person to person on what is scary and what is not. It's a very subjective feeling, more so even, I think, than some other aspects we include in our books, the feels, things like romance and sorrow, those kind of feelings, I think, and I'll talk about this a little bit in my next point, but those kind of feelings I think are even a little bit less subjective than fear. So that's probably the first thing you want to understand when you start to feel fear in reading your horror. And you can't be scared to write it as horror, because there might be some people who don't agree with that. And I'll go into that point a little bit more later. So my second point is that fear is a very primal feeling. I think fear and humor are two of the things that they're most, they come out of this place in us that doesn't require much thought, that doesn't require much intelligence, that doesn't require much context. Now, there is a type of humor, of course, that does require context, and fear that does require context. But you can feel those feelings without knowing anything about a situation, and it's instant. It comes in a flash, and you don't need to engage your mind and think about it at all. Whereas if we're talking about, making one of your readers cry, for instance, if they don't understand the context and they don't know the characters, then that's going to be very difficult for them. Because fear is so primal, you can't fake it. You can't slowly lead a character into it. It just kind of is or it isn't. You're going to have a hard time trying to convince someone who isn't scared of something that, hey, this is actually terrifying. Whereas if you sit down and talk with someone, you might be able to be like, hey, I shipped this couple for this reason, and you should too. So that's kind of my second point, and that does feed into, like I said, fear is very subjective. You either are scared of it or you aren't. And because of that fear and horror, it's very difficult to write. You either get it right or you don't. And if you don't get it right, you could miss out on a certain audience just because it's subjective. But if you cannot hit fear correctly, then horror just isn't a good genre to write in. It takes some talent. It takes some ability to create that instant reaction. I think probably the best way to deal with that is, if you're interested in writing horror, if you enjoy horror, make sure you're consuming good quality horror. So we're moving on to my next point. Fear is not a good focus for your story. And it's going to sound kind of odd, because when I say horror, you're like, well, this is a story that's kind of built around fear. And that is correct. I would say there's a lot of books that have fear in them that are not horror, because that is not the focus, that is not the intent of the writer. The writer is not writing it with the desire to cause fear in the reader. Whereas if you're a horror writer, your desire is to cause fear. That is why you're writing the book. But I think there is a difference between writing a horror that is all about just terrifying your reader or grossing them out, versus writing a horror that actually has some content to it. I think fear is very, very effective, like I said, because it either is or isn't. It's that split second. You either are afraid or you're not. You're not going to be convinced of it later. Because it is such a primal feeling. I think fear is one of the most powerful things to use to convey a theme. You can really bring something on a whole different level that doesn't even need to be fully spoken, that people just understand on this deeper level because it was brought to them through fear. And I think the comedy is the same way. You can tell some really powerful messages through comedy, because it's primal. Whereas if you're talking about, some of these other emotions, it can be harder to get the theme across subliminally, because those feelings and those themes and those emotions take some building up, take some thought into them. So I think because of that, if you choose to write a horror that is fully focused just on grossing people out or scaring people, like, it might be effective as a good, like, popcorn film and enjoyable and entertaining, but it's not going to be real high quality horror. We're talking about the difference between, sitting down and watching the Halloween movies versus sitting down and watching Quiet Place. And there's a real difference there in, even the audience would be like, hey, look, this is good fun, to be scared, to have this rush of adrenaline. However, this isn't, this is a popcorn film. This is a, Halloween fun night. This isn't high quality horror. Now I know there are some people who might argue with me about that, but I think overall, if we're looking at really, really quality horror, if you're focusing on fear and not giving it a stronger message and not giving it a stronger core, you're really missing out on something powerful there. So this kind of goes back to my first point, being fear being subjective, and that is kind of my first like real solid tip here, is to figure out what scares you, what you're afraid of, and to focus in on that. Because fear is so subjective, you're never going to scare everybody with what you're writing. There's going to be a few people who, are not fully scared, or who may do, this shiver, but it's not going to keep them up at night. But if you focus on what you know and what you're good at, you're going to have a more effective scare for your audience, and you're going to be able to work with those people who connect with you and your fear. So instead of trying to just appeal to the masses and be like, oh, people are scared of serial killers and blood and gore, so I better dump that in there. And then there's ghosts, and then so let's just mix in everything. Instead of trying to pull that off, just focus on what you are afraid of, what keeps you up at night, what gives you the chills. And that is the most effective way, I say, of finding your audience, finding people who think like you, who want to actually read your story. And if you hear noise going on, there's actually people moving into my apartment complex, so you might hear some stuff happening. My next tip: the most terrifying thing to the majority of people is the unknown. And I think that this is why ghost stories are so effective to me, and why things like Supernatural, for instance, the first few episodes were really scary and kept me up. And then after that, it's not so terrifying even anymore. Even Haunting of Hill House, once we started to actually, have conversations with the ghosts and walk around with them in the final episodes, wasn't so scary for me. And that's eventually, every book is going to get to that point, because you're trying to solve a mystery. And once you start solving things and answering questions, instead of just leaving these dangling tales for your writers to be like frustrated with, eventually you're going to have to start tying those off and solving that unknown. And I think that's kind of where that release comes in, and the benefit of horror, of exploring something that's unknown and that was previously terrifying, and then resolving that. But if you really, really want to terrify your reader, I would suggest the less they know, the better. So if, for instance, I have ghosts in my stories, if I took the supernatural approach and was like, okay, you can defeat ghosts by, putting a ring of salt around the bed and, shooting these certain kind of bullets at them, or hitting them with iron, or saying a certain kind of spell, you can cast them out or whatnot. Those kind of things are going to change the entire story, because suddenly your reader knows how to defeat this monster and exactly the rules they're playing by, and it becomes more of an adventure story than it is a horror. If you can walk into a situation and say, all I have to do is this, this, and this, then the conflict that comes at you is a hurdle to get over, but it's not as terrifying as if you're going into a situation without knowing what is going on, or if something is sprung on you and you have no clue what to do in that situation. So particularly in the Raventree Society, for instance, I have the ghosts that my characters encounter. I try not to follow the same rules twice, and not to have a simple answer to say, okay, well, we defeated this ghost, or we escaped this ghost by doing this. So this ghost, we can also escape by doing the same thing. I try to avoid that because it takes away a lot of the fear factor for the reader. And the reader goes in and they're put in this situation with the character in which they don't know the way out. I would highly suggest, when you're writing horror, to, even if you know the rules and have the rules written down, to hold those back from the reader for as long as possible. Okay, next tip: use all the senses. And I think this is a good writing tip in general. but especially with horror, because horror is so primal. And you'll see a lot of horror movies and shows have come out recently. It's kind of a running joke. You have Bird Box, where you can't see. You have Quiet Place, where you can't make noise and one of the characters can't hear. You had that one, Hush, where the character was deaf and mute. So you have these stories built around the idea of losing one of your senses. And senses are very important in horror. Your reader is going to get a lot more of a reaction from a character touching something that scares them or smelling something that scares them versus every time just seeing a ghost or an apparition. If you have the same sense used over and over and over again, you don't kind of expand, you're really missing out on a lot of opportunities. And I would say horror is one of those genres where having a little bit more flowery writing, having a little bit more detail is going to work in your benefit, because you really don't want to miss the small details. Sometimes the scariest things can be, walking out of a room, walking back in, and something has moved, and you don't know who moved it, and there's no one else. So those kind of details, those small things, can do a lot more towards setting the mood than a big obvious fear. I think a lot of times, you hear it said that once you see the monster, it's no longer scary. And so these are ways that you can build up that tension and that fear without taking away that sense of mystery and that sense of the unknown. All right, so my next point is good characters are essential to good horror. I've seen way too many horror films and horror books that will just kind of toss characters into the meat grinder and be like, this is scary. Just, grab, this generic college kid who's, messing around with spells she shouldn't and throw her into the meat grinder. And then, or the common trope of, the black guy being the first to die, which we all know from Walking Dead is definitely a thing. So we have these situations where these shows and these books will just kind of toss characters in and expect you to be afraid because there's a lot of death and there's a lot of blood and there's a lot of gore. This is especially true, I think, in like body horror, which is definitely not my favorite thing. I know some people enjoy it. So I don't want to say that's bad horror, but I don't think if you are going for the kind of fear that's going to be lingering and that's going to stay with your reader, that just tossing characters into the meat grinder is the right way to go. The most effective tool I've found for Raventree is having deep and layered characters that your reader can connect to in some way. Having a character who's just what we call cipher, someone that you can insert yourself into, say like Bella Swan from Twilight is a very common example of this. But just having a character who doesn't have a personality, who doesn't have goals or emotions, and expecting your reader to connect to that, that's not going to be very effective for getting your readers to connect to them. The more your reader can connect to a character and put themselves in their shoes, the more they are going to be affected by the actual horror. If they have a character who they're not afraid if they're going to die because they don't really care about them, then it's going to come across really weak. And I think a lot of people also think that you need to have a weak character, because if you have, a strong character who is able to overcome things, who is able to work out problems, who is able to fight back, then horror doesn't seem as realistic. And I think Writing Excuses, which is a podcast with a couple of well-known authors, focused at this at one point, and I'll actually leave it down in down below in the description. But they were talking about how it's much more effective to have a character who is very strong, who is very competent, and then put them in a situation where their competence does nothing for them. And I found this to be very true in Raventree, to have a character who isn't necessarily weak, who isn't a coward, who isn't terrified, but who is put into a situation where they don't have the ability to fight back, where there is nothing they can do, nothing they can think of, nothing they can try that is going to save them. And I think this is one of the most effective things, to have a good, well-developed character to put into your horror. If you're just, like I said, throwing people into the meat grinder, just tossing in blank characters, you're going to have a hard time. And I found with the Raventree Society, I actually have relatively few deaths, if we're not counting the flashback scenes, which I don't, because authors are like that. We're weird. There's relatively few actual deaths that happen, but because you care about the characters, the threat of that is enough. And it doesn't take me killing off everyone I introduce to you to convince you that the threat is real. I'm going to take a quick sip of tea. All right. So my final 2 points here, and I'm actually dripping tea everywhere. At the end of the day, horror isn't about fear. It's about facing the darkest place in yourself. So to just focus on blood and gore, to just rehash cliches that you've seen before isn't going to be effective to really terrify your audience. And that's not to say that you can't use cliches. Cliches in horror are cliche for a reason. The tropes in horror are tropes for a reason. There are reasons why you have these typical settings like the haunted house, or the deep dark woods or whatnot, because those things are terrifying and they are effective when used correctly. But if that's all you're doing is pulling out puzzle pieces from other stories and saying, oh, haunted houses are scary and blood on the wall is scary, and voices whispering at night are scary, and waking up to something sitting over the bed is scary, and put those all together and just be like, now I have a terrifying book. You're just going to have an amalgamation of everyone else's stories. And that's not going to be effective to truly scare your reader, because we've seen it before. We've become immune to those scares. And this isn't to say that you need to come up with something entirely new or something entirely unique, or that you have to avoid death or body horror or serial killers just slaughtering everyone in sight. That's not to say that those things are ineffective or that you can never use them. But what I find is most effective in horror is to really dig deep in yourself and to face those parts in yourself that you don't want to face the things, the fear of death, the fear of losing a loved one, those deep, dark fears that you don't want to dwell on. And when you are able to face those and question yourself and dig into those and put those on the page, that is when horror is most effective to your reader, because we are all humans living this human experience, and chances are the things that you are afraid of are also terrifying for your reader. I'm going to leave in the link below a blog post that I wrote on this, and how when I decided to write horror, it was probably the lowest thing on my list. I'm not someone who would want to put on a horror movie just to relax to. That's not me. I'm not someone who gets excited around Halloween and puts spiders and whatnot around the house. I'm not someone who enjoys being scared. You're not going to see me at Halloween Horror Nights, more likely than not. That's not me. It wasn't what I was expecting to write. However, when I started dealing with some of the harder things in life, that were facing me, I knew the only way to tell those stories and face those things was through writing horror. And I think that's why Raventree is as effective as it is with readers and why it's gotten as good reviews as it has, because I didn't cheap out and just grab whatever I thought was scary. Horror is about uncovering those parts of you. And I think that, and this kind of goes into my final point, which is kind of an extension of this one. Horror isn't just about throwing in a bad ending or the worst of the worst. Things don't have to end up bad for your characters. They can live. They don't have to be tortured. They don't have to be destroyed. They don't have to lose everything that's good. You don't need to take it to the deepest, darkest places. But you do need to take those fears and face them, those darker sides of humanity, that darker side of yourself, and face it with your readers, with your character, in order to really get to the heart of horror. I think that horror can be just as effective with a good ending, or at least a bittersweet ending, as it can when everything goes bad in the end. And I know there are some people out there who would disagree with me. There's actually this debate over The Haunting of Hill House, the TV show on Netflix, not the book. But I think that if you're going to write a powerful horror story, you have the freedom to change up the formula without losing the heart of what makes horror such a powerful genre. So those are my tips and tricks and the things that I keep in mind while writing horror. That's what I kind of delve into. Some of those are practical. Most of those are a little bit more theoretical. Perhaps at some point we'll go into more of the practical stuff. But for now, we're kind of leave it at that. So I'm dripping tea everywhere because I've been holding this the whole time. But I do want to show you guys, and you've seen me drink out of it, and I'm sure you've seen it before if you've been following me at all. This is a mug from my new line of merch. This is the Raventree Society logo. So if you are not a reader currently of the Raventree Society, in this story, I kind of use the ghost hunters trope where I have my main character, in order to be put in the situations in which he is for each episode, I have him as a ghost hunter, and he actually is the star of a TV show similar to Ghost Hunters or the like, as a paranormal investigator, and that show is called the Raventree Society, which is where the name came from. And it's not the focus of every episode, but it's definitely there. So I decided to go ahead and draw up the logo as it would have appeared in the TV show, the raven, and if you can see, there's also branches surrounding it. And so you can actually find merch. There's hoodies, there's t-shirts, there's this mug, there's stickers. Right now, this is the only design that I have on my merch store, but I definitely intend to expand, not only with Raventree merch, but also with stuff from some of my other stories. So I hope you will go check it out. I'm very excited about it. I'm very, very proud, and I love my mug very much. And also, as I said before, episode 2 of the second season is up on Amazon. You can purchase it for 99 cents. You can read all of them for free on Kindle Unlimited. I hope you will go check it out. I am very proud of these stories. Very proud of the hard work that's gone into them, and my team who's helped me to publish them. So that is it for now. I'm going to get some work in. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any favorite horror tips, anything that you like to employ while writing horror, I would love to see it in the comments. So go ahead and leave one of those. Bye for now.